Why not call the president's bluff and invite the National Guard to Chicago to see what happens?
But because there's a tremendous danger in federalizing the response to a crime. I mean, there's a reason we have the Posse Comitatus Act that says that you can't send federal troops in to do domestic law enforcement. Partly because, crime statistics are down. Is there crime in Chicago? Yes, there's crime in every city, but there's vastly more. You have a much higher chance of getting shot and killed in Wyoming than you do in Illinois. This is theater for the president, but the bigger problem is when you bring federal troops in, walking through the streets with loaded weapons, you do not send a signal to the law-abiding population that they should trust people who are armed with these weapons, right? When I go and talk to law enforcement in Chicago, they want to be able to go into communities and get responses and get tips. And what I heard from them when I was back home last month, was they're seeing a collapse in domestic violence reporting because people no longer feel safe reaching out to law enforcement to address issues in their family, which means that they can't do their job. So what Trump is doing makes our streets, makes our communities less safe, not more safe.
Congressman Casten, it's Kriti in Washington. Is there a congressional answer to how to deal with crime across American cities?
Sure. Congress writes the laws. The executive branch executes the laws. If the executive branch was obeying the laws that Congress has passed, we wouldn't have a problem. The question is, what can Congress do if Mike Johnson is not going to do oversight, not going to allow the House to do oversight to hold them accountable? I would also point out that I've now been in Congress for 4 terms, starting my 7th year here right now. The only time that I remember us ever sending federal money to local law enforcement was in the American Recovery Act, when we were particularly concerned about collapsing sales and property tax revenue, hurting the ability of law enforcement. We didn't have a single Republican vote on that bill. We also didn't have any Republican support when we added our Capitol Police officers. So yes, there are things that Congress has done to protect our men and women in law enforcement, to make sure that we bring crime down. But in my experience, we've not been able to do that with support across the aisle, because the idea that we are a country of laws where everybody is treated equally under the law is, sadly, when we have a convicted felon in the White House, a very partisan idea.
Well, you mentioned lawmaking, Congressman. I'd be curious to get your sense of what's going to happen as everyone gets back to town. It's fly-in day. As we mentioned, you've got just over a dozen legislative days to help fund the government. And so it looks like regular order is out the window here. When it comes to actually funding government operations, do you have a sense of how this ends? Are we going to shut down, or are we going to be talking about a CR that brings us to the end of the year?
Well, as of now, we've passed only 2 of the 12 appropriations bills, and they were straight partisan party line votes. So it's very hard for me to see us getting to a point between now and September 30th where we pass a robust appropriations package. So it's just going to be about the continuing resolution. And I don't know how that's all going to play out in the next couple of weeks. I think the onus is going to be really on Johnson to say, like, what can we give the Democrats to support here? Because, again, in my 4 terms, I have never seen a Republican-led House not depend on a continuing resolution to fund the government and not be able to do that without Democratic support. And I think what's hard for a lot of my Democratic colleagues is when we fund things that the White House then isn't paying for, isn't obeying the law, and we're not doing oversight, a lot of the currency, the political currency, if you will, of a continuing resolution is a little bit tougher to handle. And it's unfortunate because there are real needs that the American people have. There are real concerns about the impacts of these tariffs, about the declining job numbers that made Trump so unhappy that he fired the head of the BLS. Those are real concerns we should be focusing on, and instead we've got these sort of self-inflicted wounds we've got to muddle through. So it's going to be contentious, it's going to be sparky, and I'm not sure I know how to predict how this is going to end by the end of this month.
Contentious and sparky. Congressman Casten, what's the low-hanging fruit here? What in the next 14 legislative days can the Democrats get through?
Well, I wish we didn't have to frame this as Democrats versus Republicans, right? Because the question is, should the government continue to do things? Should people be able to go to national parks and enjoy them? Should people sign a contract and know that the courts will be open to honor the terms of that contract? Should all the things that we expect government to do, and because there has been such a radical approach to the executive branch under the Trump administration, it has become incumbent on Democrats to say, okay, who will defend the rule of law? Who will defend the Constitution? And if we are in the minority and we don't have the gavels in the House or the Senate to control agenda, our ability to push that is limited. We have our public pulpit. We can go on television shows like this and work it through. But it is hard as long as we have a majority that is more committed to sort of bowing down before Donald Trump than standing up for their constituents. It's going to be difficult.
Understood, Congressman, but couldn't Democrats actually find some gains in the throes of negotiations, if only when it came to Obamacare subsidies being extended beyond the end of this year? Is there anything that would actually move lawmakers like yourself to a yes?
Well, so there are certainly conversations along those lines, and look, generally speaking, if we say let's just agree to fund the government at current levels until the next the next period, give us time to negotiate, that's the normal course. We do that too often, frankly. I think the challenge that a lot of us have, and I'm not saying that I'm a yes or a no on this. I think we'll see how it evolves. But the challenge a lot of us have is, if Congress agrees to this and the White House doesn't abide by what we agree to, will we go back and hold them to account? And if we can't get a consensus, if we can't get an agreement, then we're left saying, well, do you trust Dr. Oz and RFK Jr. to honor those subsidies? And that degree of trust is pretty low. And this is a town that depends on trust. And when the trust is weak, the negotiations are much harder.
If we do get to a shutdown, Congressman, some Democrats have said here on this program that it would not be wise to take that course unless there was a plan to reopen. We talked to Mick Mulvaney about that on the early edition of Balance of Power today. He said Donald Trump and Russ Vought would love nothing more than to shut down the government so they can decide where their dollars go and see how long they can outlast you. Do you worry about shutting things down with no plan to reopen?
Well, I understand why we are going to have a political conversation about the shutdown, but I wish we could talk about it not in a political sense. If you're a family who depends on cancer research at the NIH to fund your experimental trials, and that trial isn't going right now because no one's taking the phone, government is effectively already shut down for you. If you're a farmer who depends on weather forecasts and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they have fired people who collectively represent 15,000 years of experience. So if you're a farmer who depends on that expertise, that agency is effectively shut down already. And we need to make sure that those agencies work for the people who need them. And if we're only viewing this through the lens of, can I get away with this and look good and make my opponent look bad, then we aren't worthy of this office. We need to make sure that government works. We need to make sure it does the things that it has to work. And the question is not, will we shut down government on September 30th? It's, how do we make sure that we don't shut it down any further than it's already shut down? And how do we make sure that those agencies that have been illegally shut down can get back to full strength and do their job? And is it even possible to do that prior to 2028? That's the conversation we should be having. And I think if we had an honest conversation with the Republicans about that issue, I think you could find a lot of area of common ground, but they've got to be willing to stand up to Trump for that to happen.